Greetings to all participants of 2021 Africa Gas Forum. Welcome to the panel dedicated to repositioning the Southern Africa gas play for agility and dynamic world. My name is Igor Hulák. I'm a partner at Carney, knowledge partner of the conference, and I am responsible for our oil and gas and energy business in Africa. I would like to acknowledge and give a special thanks to GE Gas and Power, who are the official host of this panel. I will be your moderator for this discussion. Repositioning the Southern Africa gas play for agility and dynamic world. Gas opportunities continue to rise owing to the recent reserve discoveries and the continuous energy deficit in the region. Despite the impact of COVID-19 on industries, along with political unrest in Mozambique. Furthermore, gas provides a viable opportunity to decrease dependency on coal in the region. Natural gas will remain a critical element of the global energy portfolio as Southern Africa navigates the energy transition to address both climate change and in the intention to provide electricity access to more than 600 million people currently going without. New gas discoveries coupled with an enabling environment and pivotal to the region's success if it's compete on the level playing field with its global dynamic competitors. By all means, natural gas will play a very significant role in Southern African region and particularly in South Africa. Today, we gathered very distinguished panel of experts who will discuss all the topics related to natural gas in the current business environment or going forward into the future. Let me invite all our panelists to briefly introduce themselves. First, we have Mrs. Mervyn Azeta, PSD Manager, Schlumberger, Nigeria and West Africa. Can you briefly introduce yourself?
All right, thank you so much, Igor, and good day, everyone. My name is Mervyn Azeta, and I'm a product and service delivery manager for two business lines at Schlumberger. And these business lines are the surface production systems and midstream production systems. I'm responsible for overseeing operational excellence and business development across Nigeria and West Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. Second, Mrs.
Good day, everyone.
Mrs. Nos Langezele Motiti, Regional Sales Executive, GE Gas and Power, is joining us. Please introduce yourself.
Good day, everyone. I hope you're all well. My name is Nosizwe Langezele, Regional Sales Executive for GE Gas Power, Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm based out of Johannesburg. General Electric Gas Power Systems is responsible for the development of gas-fired power plants across quite a wide portfolio of our technology in the region, as well as in partnering in some of the development elements of building and developing these plants. Looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Nos. We are also welcoming Paul Erdely-Taylor as an oil and gas manager for Standard Bank.
Hi, I look after Southern Africa oil and gas for Standard Bank. Been involved in energy for 23 years and been based in Africa since 2007 with a particular focus on LNG, gas and infrastructure.
Thank you, Paul. Another distinguished panelist is Mr. Ibrahim Takolia, founder and CEO at Green Hydrogen Solutions. Mr. Ibrahim.
Green Hydrogen Solutions focuses on the energy transition, which is how hydrogen will play a role in gas. Hydrogen is a gas, and in tandem with natural gas over time, will play a significant role in meeting net zero targets as the energy transition unfolds.
Thank you, Ibrahim. And last but not least, we have Mrs. Jennifer Zeiss, integrated energy practice leader at Africa International Advisors. Jennifer.
Good day, everybody. Yeah, Jennifer Zeiss. I've spent most of my career in industry where I've been very privileged to work on a number of gas commercialization projects, particularly in Southern Africa and Mozambique. I have more recently been working with Africa International Advisors as a practice leader, and we developed the SADC Regional Gas Master Plan. So I'm hoping that we can bring some of those insights into today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you to all. Let me start the discussion. And many industries have been impacted by the recent COVID pandemic, which is by no means over and still is felt by all of us. And today we are also meeting in the digital space, not in person as we would have done normally. And the last time we met in Cape Town about a year ago. What is the expected recovery trajectory for oil and gas industries and all other downstream industries in the region, and particularly in South Africa? Maybe Paul, can you share your views?
Yeah, thanks, Igor. So compared to a number of industries, for example, nightclubs or sporting clubs or something, Southern Africa oil and gas didn't really have a bad COVID, so to speak. Kicking off in upstream, the key point is that nobody has pulled out. All of the IOCs have stayed in Angola despite its mature position. From an upstream perspective, exploration has been delayed. Key wells such as Angoche, Zambezi, Venus, Block 48 have been put back a year, but none have been cancelled. In terms of the largest program in the region, the LNG, Mozambique LNG has broadly stayed on track. Coral has absolutely stayed on track. And the only real deferment has been Rovuma LNG, which is now starting to show signs of moving back up the agenda as the oil price recovers. But for those snakes, there's been a couple of ladders. And what we started to see is really the movement towards disposals. And Sasol in particular, through its own corporate challenges, is starting to dispose of individual assets. And they're likely to free up the gas infrastructure sector in particular to promote the availability of feedstock to South Africa in particular. And those transactions will come through in 2021. And then just a brief word on the energy transition. This obviously catches huge global headlines, especially in a European lens. But from what we're seeing from a Southern Africa lens, there's really two key points which are generally beneficial. The first one is that Mozambique in particular, its LNG is really focused at Asia. India is screaming as a bullseye target for Mozambique LNG. India is aiming to reduce emissions by a third in the next decade. It's aiming to invest $60 billion in gas infrastructure, likely to be a key target for Mozambique in coal to gas switching. And here in South Africa, the strong expectation is that after certain projects take FID, for example, the Matola project and the Sasol disposals, you're likely to see a large amount of gas-fired power in South Africa. So all in all, COVID could have been a lot worse from a Southern African oil and gas perspective.
Thank you, Paul. And let me a little bit push you further on that. And you mentioned that the gas sector in the Southern Africa, and particularly in South Africa, even with some of the disposal projects of Sasol, is a hot spot in the gas sector. Do you expect that we will soon see some new brands or new logos in the gas sector of Southern African region as a coming investors?
In terms of disposals, it's obviously going to depend on who wins an individual process. But what I think you can assume over time is that a number of the parties who are either involved in from an equity perspective or purchasing Mozambique's LNG may well look very seriously at entering the gas supply chain in Southern Africa.
Thank you, Paul. Maybe expanding further about the growing trajectory of the importance of gas in the Southern African region or in South Africa, which sectors would be most impactful to stimulate further demand for gas in addition to gas to electricity, which is obvious. It's not only topical or the hot topic for Southern African region, it's the whole continent hot topic, or gas to power. But what are the other sectors in addition to the gas to power or gas to electricity? Mervyn, would you have any views there?
Yeah, great question. I think it's been said that without anchoring the demand, development of natural gas resources will be pretty tricky. So thank you for asking that. I would say that beyond gas to power applications, which clearly is central to the region's economic future, Southern African countries could leverage the regional gas finds for at least 3 other sectors, both in the short and long term. These sectors are industrial, transport, and commercial. And this is not necessarily in decreasing order of impact. I'm just saying that when you put them together, they will allow for maximum utilization of the gas resources. On the industrial front, I see a strong focus on gas to liquids or chemicals, and especially LNG, like you heard Paul say, which has pretty huge export as well as inter-regional trade potential. And it's interesting that the leaders of countries like Mozambique and Tanzania, where you have much of the supply potential located, are demonstrating their commitment to build this capabilities or expand their LNG infrastructure, irrespective of all the challenges that we've seen in the last few months, including COVID-19 pandemic, the insurgency, and then even project profitability concerns. In South Africa, for example, we see that the gas from the Luped and Broopada wells could very easily be piped through the 70-kilometer pipeline in its vicinity to the Petro SA gas to liquid facility or refinery in Mossel Bay for processing and distribution as high quality liquid and chemical products. These products will include transport fuels like, auto gas, motor oils for cleaner mobility and valuable feedstocks as well for harder to abate sectors like the cement industry or the chemicals industry. And to move goods around across this region, you would see logistics company looking to use the transport fuels or LNG fuels as their, major fuels for long haul trucks. And that's obviously going to facilitate significant emissions reduction and cost savings, estimated to be between 15% and 25%. Lastly, I think there is also increasing demand for cheaper, cleaner, and healthier fuel sources for the rural consumers, and also a push to decarbonize the domestic heating needs like cooking and hot water. The retail services like the restaurants and malls are beginning to rely more on gas for powering their businesses. Construction is also looking into using gas a lot more. And then of course, agriculture for fertilizers and other things that we need in the agricultural space. I'd stop there.
Yeah, I can add on the from a green hydrogen perspective, hydrogen will take some time before it becomes more mainstream, but it will have an effect on the ammonia value chain, which can also be used for fertilizers and heating and cooling as well, where you can optimize heating from electrolysis together with heating from the use of the hydrogen. And then one would have also noted the recent oxygen shortage in the country because of COVID-19. So with the hydrogen value chain, you get a byproduct, which is oxygen, and that could also have a significant impact. And then in terms of optimizing natural gas with hydrogen, you can combine hydrogen with natural gas and make synthetic methane and sequester the carbon. And use that carbon in other industrial processes. So if you look at some of the technologies that are being evolving in that space, there'll be significant synergies between the two gases to decarbonize the natural gas emissions over time and as the costs become more competitive.
Thank you. Thank you, Ibrahim. All of that suggests that more natural gas is needed in South Africa, in Southern Africa. With that outlook, what is the right strategy to speedily improve infrastructure, to eliminate value loss along the value chain, either in the production, transport, storage, and distribution? As we know, there are limited ways of how to get natural gas into South Africa currently with the pipelines. The LNG, if you allow me, still a little bit of a topic of the discussion rather than the real projects. So how do we solve that? Jennifer.
Oh, thanks, Igor. Yeah, good question. Look, I think it's clear any opportunities for natural gas are going to have to be regional. We need scale to develop all phases of that value chain, be it on the upstream, be it midstream where pipelines and LNG facilities, or even in the downstream, if we're looking at things like ammonia, we're going to need scale. And that is going to require aggregation, and it's going to be aggregation at a regional level, aggregation at a national level. But then the dilemma is we need to integrate that with distributed and smaller scale gas markets as well. Luckily, there have been some technology shifts in small scale delivery mechanisms, and that's going to be making those so-called virtual pipelines viable going forward. That can then enable downstream market development without us having to spend a lot of money and on those very high capital infrastructure developments, particularly now in the beginning of the development of the markets. So the way I see it, we need to look at that strategy in two phases. In the short term, we need to be developing those low-hanging fruit options, as Mervyn said. Power is going to be the first mover. But we need to utilize lower risk gas delivery mechanisms such as small scale LNG, road and rail LNG, even compressed gas. We can do that by adopting hub and spoke models where we have a number of hubs in the region. We bring in conventional scale LNG, deliver that to floating storage and regas units. And that way we can enable breaking bulk central regas facilities, and then we can use those small scale options to transfer the gas to the supply nodes. This will then hopefully help us to develop the gas markets, but in a more distributed fashion and a stepwise fashion, and increase demand over time. That's a short-term story. In the longer term, we have to have regional aggregation models. And we need to develop those economic corridors in the east, west, and south of the region. And it's at this stage that those larger infrastructure projects come into play. We also need far more integrated planning at a regional level. And we need to bring in standardization, harmonization of policies and regulatory frameworks. And at this stage, those bodies such as SADC, SARERA, SAPP are going to play a very important role in the facilitation and moving to that new energy future. And I just wanted to touch on what Abraham said a little bit earlier. I think what we really need to do at that stage is take cognizance of that and have a full comprehension of what that energy future could look like. We certainly don't want to be building large-scale infrastructure that becomes stranded. So any infrastructure that we do build must be looking at scenarios for the future. We must be bringing flexibility into that infrastructure. And just as an example, if we are going to build pipelines, we must be accommodating a hydrogen economy in that future and make sure that those pipelines could facilitate a hydrogen economy should it play out. So I believe taking this approach of looking at a more immediate short-term plan to take care of our immediate energy access and security problems and challenges, but we need to start building that bridge of tangible, flexible solutions to take us to an energy future, which, as we all know, we fast transition into.
Yeah, in terms of the strategy to employ for the value chain, I think the most important bit that Jennifer touched on was the use of the hub and spoke model, which is how gas distribution evolved in other areas of the world. And I think South Africa is a significant energy user, and it has all the right ingredients to transition to a gas economy.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Ibrahim. Jennifer, just maybe picking up on your view, you see it more gradual rather than going straight to the large mega infrastructure projects. That's what I understood. Is that the solution in the short term? And how do we get to the big ultimate solution with the big infrastructure, ensuring that the gas can get into South Africa at the scale and the volume that will be needed in the future?
Yeah, the way I see it, I mean, it's when it comes to gas commercialization, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. You need the market to develop the fields, and you need the fields to develop the markets. So that's why the suggestion of going for a short-term solution using more flexible delivery options and using more small-scale options, so that we can bring the gas in large, we can bring in LNG suppliers. We can then get the gas to the smaller distributed markets, and then hopefully by that way grow the markets so that you can bring in the options for longer term infrastructure, which then is a lot more permanent and a lot more inflexible.
Thank you. Obviously, this part of industry, natural gas, as you mentioned, Jennifer, requires quite rigorous regulatory framework and policies framework for the investors to be attracted to this area. What type of regulations and policies we need to consider or we need to put in place to attract investments across all parts of the value chain, whether in the upstream, midstream, or downstream? Paul, any views from your side? Very frequently talking to the potential investors, so you may bring very fresh points of view.
Yeah, just a few. The convention in upstream is to agree these upfront in licensing rounds or bilateral negotiations, and that normally happens in most of the Southern African markets. There's something of an outstanding issue in South Africa at the moment, where there's been various to and fro about whether the oil and gas legislation should be part of the mining legislation or vice versa. And the issue has now slightly been forced by the double discovery of oil and of condensate and gas by Total, just to make things a bit harder off the south coast, which what Mervyn referred to. But we really hope that can be resolved in the next period, ideally this year, and perhaps also allow some onshore exploration in South Africa as well. In terms of midstream and downstream, really the two key themes we like to talk about are the technological change in the industry, and this has been very well mentioned by colleagues already. Jennifer, Ibrahim, Mervyn have talked about either hydrogen or small-scale LNG. And it's how do you make individual policies and regulations suitable for something like small-scale LNG competing against diesel in trucks. There's a great example coming along, which are the various options for the use of South Africa's coastal refineries. It could easily be the situation that the 4 different sites have 4 different purposes. Mervyn's mentioned Mossel Bay already. Chevref could well be a storage terminal. NREF could be a storage terminal. And there's a debate as to whether SAPREF could be an LNG import terminal as well as a storage terminal. So again, that's going to need some sort of creative thinking around legislation and regulations. And then, of course, in the South African case especially, we've got the famous case of gas to power, which is being considered over a number of locations at different times. Kruger, Richards Bay, Saldanha, and we now have a situation where probably the RMIPPs are going to force the issue under emergency legislation to establish the precedent going forward. And then in a couple of other markets to mention briefly, Angola is a lot of fun from a gas perspective. Gas didn't exist, it couldn't be sold commercially. Now you have a gas law, but there's still a deal waiting to be done under the gas law. Probably blocks 20 and 21 will be the first real big upstream developments, but probably the backfilling of Angola LNG will also take account of there. And then just to finish off, you have the domestic gas case in Mozambique. It will come, it will follow. It's probably going to need 2 different onshore projects to take FID, not just one. but that is also a situation where legislation and regulations are going to have to come. So in essence, our message is look at what the investors need. Don't be too dogmatic on policy. Look at what can be financed and ultimately look at what a government can tax for the benefit of its people and employment of the same. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Paul, for that view.
Yeah, I think in terms of the regulations, I agree with everything that Paul said. Just to add that there's a tremendous amount of goodwill in the world around what they call green recovery. So what we are doing, whether we use natural gas or hydrogen, is reducing South Africa's carbon emissions. And what we need to do is find a way to use carbon markets as well to attract the investments that we need to help the economy transition. It's a mammoth task. There is not enough pension money in South Africa or debt in South Africa's banks to complete everything that needs to be done. So I think if the government could think very strategically about how to use carbon markets and the goodwill and the stimulus measures that are being announced, and also by multilateral institutions that are tying, transition to finance, to try and put together some framework that can help this happen quicker and enable energy security at the same time. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul and Ibrahim. Obviously, the projects in the oil and gas sector, and particularly also in the gas sector, are quite significant projects. And we are talking in the Southern African region about the cross-border collaboration, government-to-government collaboration also. And it's not only private sector, but it's also the governments who have a very important role to play. How can governments in the region collaborate to provide a response addressing the current political tensions, but also ensuring stability, creating environment for the energy security? Nos, any points of view from your side?
Thanks, Igor, for the question. So one of the critical things which Jennifer touched on earlier was this concept around creating the right economies of scale and the right anchor projects to enable the commercialization and bankability, specifically in this instance, I'll speak of gas to power projects. And that means that there's a certain environment and a climate that needs to exist interregionally, not only from a policy point of view, but from an investor protection point of view, to allow for this meaningful aggregation to happen. So my response to what is it that governments can do is that there needs to be initially a shared understanding around why the demand needs to be aggregated in relation to financing and bankability and commercial viability of that project. And I think that's kind of the first conversation that we need to have. The second piece of conversation that I believe needs to be held is around what does this mean for the economic development of the regions that are in question. And I think there has to be buy-in and a view that there is benefit for all that's participating. Nobody wants to go through an elaborate task of aggregating demand if they feel that there'll be no benefit of industrialization for them, there'll be no benefit of energy security for them, there'll be no benefit of actually creating other markets, as mentioned earlier by Mervyn. And then thirdly, what's also become quite significant and important in this collaboration between governments is, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. We've got instruments that can be used to coordinate these efforts. And it's very important that, for example, we look into the South African power pool and understand how is it that we can use this institution and this structure to coordinate the efforts. It becomes quite laborious when you want to start brand new interministerial or interregional trade committees to start embarking on this conversation, rather than really using state agencies that are already there and quite available. And I think that once you have a central point that can, ensure that this coordination happens, it's going to bring about a very exciting opportunity, I think, for our region, even as we consider issues of even aggregated export demand. How would we manage that? It brings in interesting conversations around how do we ensure that we minimize project-on-project risk with multilateral agreements that come out of this. And it can give a very strong, I think, basis and navigation for, I think, other especially in Africa, as our African regional trade begins to open, how these can be coordinated, managed, and then operationalized going forward. So for me, in a nutshell, centrally, it really is about a win-win for all. It is about a structure that exists, that can coordinate these efforts, and also then about developing this good practice of multilateral agreements that are housed under one umbrella. And I think that way, then we're going to really see that industrialization take off in the region as we need it.
Thank you, Nos. Paul, any additional views?
Yeah, I'll give you a slightly different premise. I mean, one of the most famous phrases by President Reagan was the most terrifying phrase in the English language is "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And I think it's very clear that the governments in the region have to be quite careful about where they can add value and where they should sort of focus. In the upstream sector, it's really a case of what President Reagan said: just pass the legislation and stay out the way. If that is done, then they tax, and there's an awful lot of money flows into the country. Good example is the Mozambican case, where Mozambique has still not put a dollar into the projects. It's benefited from about $50 billion of investment so far, probably will rise to $120 billion, and enormous tax revenues over the next 30, 50 years, as we put in our reports. I think where it gets slightly more complex, and not a challenge to Nosizwe, but a sort of comment, is there's a couple of realities with the African governments. And we're very active participants in the capital markets. The first one is virtually all of them are sub-investment grade with poor credit qualities. What's also important is the off-takers in the power sector, state-owned enterprises, if you will, are normally poor quality credits as well, often with a checkered history of payment in a certain number of jurisdictions. So that challenge has to be solved to sort of get to where we want to go to. And I think the other one we would focus on is what I call PSL, which is not the Premier Soccer League in South Africa, but it's project-specific legislation. Generally, you find pretty much anywhere in an African country, unless you want to open a bar or a steers, you need some form of enabling legislation, especially when you're looking at technological changes such as LNG importation, small-scale LNG, using sites for different purposes. It's very important for the governments to be quite sort of smart and future focused to get that legislation passed. And then the last one of all is the underlying economics. Subsidies or the lack of cost reflective tariffs, which are often maintained by governments for very valid socio-economic reasons, can be the enemies of individual projects. But if those are done, then there's every chance of making progress.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Nos, for your views. Let me stay on that topic, and Paul, you very nicely use the phrase "we are from government, we are here to help." Let me turn this a little bit upside down and ask the question. So how can private sector take a lead, or how can private sector and government to collaborate or to cooperate to address all of these challenges that you, Nos, and you, Paul, mentioned, whether they are in the legislation, whether they are in the policies, or whether they are in the speed, in operational areas? What would be the best way of private sector taking a lead or finding the way of collaborating with the government? Nos, maybe you want to share some views from your experience, and by all means of day-to-day life, I think.
Yeah, and I think, and it's great that Paul mentions that, right? Because these ideas sound wonderful and great on paper, and until we have to make them quite pragmatic around the how. Yes, we talk about regional integration. We talk about LNG infrastructure being brought into country to stimulate these areas of economy. But then what we've come to understand and learn about some of the limitations of our own government is that at times the planning gets done in isolation. And actually, even with the private sector, we go and do our planning, we develop our technology, we coordinate ourselves in isolation. And often the buffer that stands between this joint planning simply are just the procurement laws of country, right? That kind of create this rigidity between private sector and public sector. This is a NOS view. There has to be a number of projects in the country that are targeted, or let me say that are strategic enough for country to understand that early engagement is required, so that we can all then have a role to play within the planning process of that overall strategy. Simply put, we talk about gas to power. From a GE perspective, when you start talking about South Africa has a gas to power program, I go on overdrive, right? What I want to ensure is that the technology and the services support that I have are going to be the right fit for any power plant that is being thought of. And myself and probably project developers, we go into crafting these really grand ideas around what needs to happen. Until then, you actually understand that South Africa in particular is going through this just transition, number one, and the just transition includes maybe, greenfield gas-fired power plants are not the right fit for country. Maybe we should be considering how we're going to initially repurpose the coal-fired power plants that we have in that discussion. But then there becomes a misalignment, because when I go and craft a technology strategy, it really does not speak to what does actually repurposing mean for the country of South Africa. And repurposing is certainly not, and we try to really employ this. I often say, I can bring you the best turbine, the most efficient turbine that will provide this country with the energy security that it needs. But I cannot guarantee you job for job, coal to gas jobs. I cannot provide for you an entire industrial value chain that is comparable to the coal value chain in gas jobs. And I also cannot come up with those answers independently as an OEM. And so what that means is that I need to be able to collaborate with government very early onwards to understand the trajectory, understand the transition and how they want to move in that. So that as I go away and craft and bake my ideas with my private sector buddies that come from the development space, the integration space, the financial space, I ensure that I can then meet the needs of the country holistically. And so if, take another example, we get a release of a bid that says we need to repurpose a power plant. Where I sit best as General Electric is in technology. And the portion that I will want to respond to within the greater need is only the technology portion. But if we begin to engage early enough, what type of leverage can be harnessed from the private sector? Tech being fundamental. Tech from efficiency, tech from servicing, tech from the digital transition that's happening within the energy space. Number two, I can then go to all my friends like Paul at the bank and say to them, we have this plan in mind. What the government is now requesting from us is that they don't want IPPs anymore. They want public-private procurement. What does this look like? What does this mean for us? I can engage my developer partners, the Aquas, the Global X, the Azuras, to say, how do you operate within a hybrid IPP model? How can we innovate? I can also engage around kind of the basket of skills that I have and that I've developed and referenced over time, not only globally, but also within the region, to say, what type of skill sets do we have and skills transfer plans do we have that have been successful in other regions that I can then bring into the conversation with our government? But in order for this conversation to happen, we need our government to also play. And where they play is, I think, the political will around accepting that strategic projects may be hindered by some of the procurement laws that we have in the country. But how do you create fairness and equity as you think of strategic projects? Number one. Secondly, it's around policy and regulation, right? What type of policies do I need to put in place right now? Gas utilization plan, gas master plan, regional integration plans. Do I need to focus on? And then they talk about the entire decarbonization strategy. Is it realistic that South Africa, in the forecast that we see, is going to introduce the quantiles of renewables into our system without a technology, for example, such as gas, as we're speaking about today, that is flexible, that can create the right type of intermittency that you need in the system? And so that thought needs to be there, it needs to be regulated. And then we both bring and I will say we both bring our best bets in terms of what are most enabling effects to have that conversation. So in other markets, as General Electric, I can sell a turbine and I can go toe-to-toe and compete. In markets that are still developing these gas economies, but also wanting to industrialize and begin other sectors, I need to ensure that I'm in the pre-planning, integrated, advisory, early onwards conversation with our state. And it's attitude at the end of the day. If there's a willingness on both sides to do that, and it's not comfortable for all sides, and I think people always assume that the private sector is always willing to jump in. The private sector also is not comfortable with working with models that are outside of what's norm for them. But if we both take off this hat and think of innovative ways to partner and co-create, in fact, then I believe that programs such as the Gas to Power program, which South Africa has been trying, to put in place for 10 years, we might actually see traction that will enable it to go forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Nos. And I can see a lot of passion and energy from, accumulated experience from all of this discussion. One can feel it from your voice. Ibrahim, any points of view to add on that topic?
Yeah, I think, one of the challenges that South Africa faces is the declining availability factor of the coal-fired power plants. And that is a reality which only gets worse over time. And, the longer we leave it, the more challenging it's going to become. You saw last week that the center of global energy in the world got derailed by, a temperature fluctuation that it didn't anticipate. So we have to, as a country, start to think of resiliency and take it more seriously. And we understand the challenges around the energy transition, and they are valid challenges. How do you employ people? But we also cannot let that hold up the energy security that the country is going to need. And so from that perspective, I think there's an opportunity to collaborate with various parties, like I said, using the goodwill as the world emerges from COVID-19 and looks at green stimulus measures to figure out how to, move to natural gas with renewable energy and then balance South Africa's energy requirements.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all of these deep, very interesting insights. And let me maybe wrap up, and the discussions that we had is clearly confirming that energy transition is there. It's not just in Europe or far away somewhere in the northern hemisphere. It's also close to our home. It's in the southern Africa. It's on African continent. It's coming. Yeah? Even some of our champions who thought that might be that the topics of energy transition and clean energy can be very distant, learned their lessons recently with their financiers making very, very clear statements about the willingness and appetite to fund the business that is not really responding well to the energy transition agenda. Natural gas is going to play a very important role in the energy transition of the Southern African region, and particularly in South Africa, together with renewables. However, I think there is always an elephant in the room, and allow me to say that this is about how we go about the energy transition in Southern African region. We, in particular in South Africa, our power generation is very much coal-based. There is a need to properly address just transition, and Nos, you very much touched upon that. Yeah, you can deliver the best turbine, the most efficient turbine in the world. Can you actually deliver 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 jobs ratio to replace all of the jobs in the coal value chain, not only in the upstream but also in the midstream, downstream, and infrastructure logistics? Yeah, that is a very important question. How we go about the just transition, and let me maybe finish the conversation or our debate on the just transition. Nos, any additional points of view from your side about the just energy transition agenda in South Africa?
So thanks, Igor, for the question. One of the great, conversations that we had earlier around all of the other industries which need the power sector, as an anchor, that we can see grow out of the landing of natural gas on our shores. So when we talk about just transition, I think top of mind, of course, should be this decarbonization strategy using technology that ensures that we are on path and we are committed to it. And really providing the energy security that country needs. I think that's the first piece. The next piece is the thinking around the economies and the industries within all, whether it is upstream or even downstream, that can be ignited by the availability of gas. And earlier, there was a comment by Mervyn around the petrochemical sector, the transportation sector that can benefit. And so when we look at just transition, it is my personal opinion that to make an assumption that as we have this transition, there's going to be an evening out effect or an equalizer effect purely based on power supply is quite naive. It means we have to think a bit deeper about the gas industry as a whole. What's great is that there has been a lot of conversation about what does this gas industry actually look like and how can we map it? Because ultimately that is what supports the transition and makes it not only something that the country will get the right buy-in for, but then you will also diversify our economy in different strategies. So it is very critical that we look at the full value chain that can support the transition, new economies that can be built, new sets of skills that can be built within these transition, and really move the country forward. And I love this because they use it on TV, from analog to digital. Sometimes that's what it feels like to me. What are we going to need for the pull factor for that to happen?
Thank you, Nos. Mervyn, would you like to add any points of view?
Yes, I would. And it would just be a recommendation, really. And it's really about, when we talk about the just transition, I think it's very important that we lead these conversations or actions in such a way that it transition to a cleaner energy future, whether in the Southern African region or beyond or across the continent, happens in a fair way. And Nos had mentioned something about fairness earlier when she was talking about private sector engagement, is making sure that we leave no one behind. So it's important that we engage the communities and as many stakeholders as possible. It has to be a broad stakeholder conversation. We engage them early, and we also think through how women and vulnerable population are impacted by whatever we do. So we must make sure that we engage women, for example, across the entire infrastructure value chain, and ensure that the cost of all of these solutions and actions are not borne heavily by the consumers.
Thank you, Mervyn. And let me summarize our discussion. And I would say, wow, that is an agenda for natural gas in Southern Africa. I think we've gone through the whole entire value chain, and identified number of very pressing challenges and opportunities for natural gas. What is very obvious is that natural gas will play a very important role in the future energy mix of Southern African region. It will be a very important topic on the agenda of energy transition in the Southern African region, and in South Africa we have a very important topic of just energy transition that will need to be addressed by not only the governments but also by the models how the private sector will engage with the government players. On that note, let me thank all of our distinguished and esteemed panelists. Let me thank Mervyn from Schlumberger. Let me thank Mrs. Nos from GE Gas Power. Let me thank Paul joining the discussion from Standard Bank, Ibrahim from Green Hydrogen Solution, and Jennifer from the Africa International Advisors. And let me also thank GE Gas Power for being an official host of this panel. Hope, my dear panelists, you enjoyed the discussion, and hopefully we also made a small contribution to the advancement of the natural gas agenda in the Southern African region. Thank you very much, and greetings to all participants of the Africa Gas Forum.
Thank you.
Thank you, Igor.
Thank you.